So Sticks and Stones is Dave Chappelle's most recent Netflix special. And, it got a lot of hype, a lot of publicity, a little bit of controversy, a few critics and publications that didn't really like it, like Vox and Vice and Rotten Tomatoes when it first came out. They delegated it to like a handful of critics to rate it instead of opening it up to the public, and they basically gave it a poor rating. But then once they opened it up to the public, obviously it got a very good rating. And I'm a fan of Chappelle, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the controversies and what I actually find uh, good or funny or insightful about the special. So basically, first thing is first is just acknowledging that obviously in this special, it was probably his most politically charged special that he's ever made. Um, he's typically not like a real political comedian, but this time around, the entire special was sort of loaded with social commentary, and that's not normal for him. And obviously, he picked uh, topics that were intentionally meant to be somewhat incendiary or inflammatory or just controversial in general. But but I think that it's a little bit oversimplistic to label him as just being quote unquote reactionary, or like he's just trying to be an edge lord for the sake of it. I think that some people who maybe favor that sort of thing have latched onto it and used it as their poster boy for railing against the left and railing against PC and all that other stuff. But it all comes down to how well crafted the actual comedy is, and some people say it's not. I think it was. Um, Essentially, what I liked about it was the fact that it was political in nature and it was social commentary driven, and yet it didn't come from one particular point of view or another. Like usually when a comedian's special is heavily based on political discussion or social commentary, they're coming with a clear ideological point of view, and they're basically almost preaching that point of view in a way that they try to be as funny about it as they can. Um, Guys like Carlin, guys like Bill Hicks, newer comics like Trevor Noah, Amy Schumer, etc. Um, and it's not like that can't be done well, but I do find that that sort of thing to me can turn into a crutch as well, that becomes sort of lazy and uninspired and just predictable, really. And sometimes it comes across like a little bit of just everybody in the audience is on your side and you're preaching this ideology and you're all just sort of patting yourselves on the back for being so enlightened and so smart, and the punchline of the joke is always how stupid the other side is. You know what I mean? And Chappelle sort of stepped out of that box, and essentially he always kept you guessing which direction he was going to come from, because he would say things that were, progressive in nature or whatever, fall in line with the common orthodox progressive narrative of the day. But then he would say things that step outside that, and so that was the element of, keeping it somewhat fuzzy, keeping it somewhat unpredictable, making it so that he's sort of speaking out of both sides of his mouth, and the crowd latches on to what he says, based on where they stand uh, in terms of their own political agenda and ideology. An example would be the abortion joke, which a lot of people don't like because they see it as somehow casting doubt on the pro-choice arguments. But I don't think that it was meant to be taken seriously. I think it was just meant to once again sort of blur the lines of what's right and what's wrong, and take an issue that actually is kind of sort of blurry in the first place, like abortion, and sort of play to both sides of it, um, without coming across as just preaching. And the setup when he says the thing like, "I'm not in favor of abortion," and then one guy or he says I'm not pro-abortion, and then one guy cheers, and he's like, "Oh, shut up," and he's like, "And I'm not against abortion either," blah blah blah, and he goes on with it, right? But that was the gist of how he was taking people a little bit by surprise because they're looking for that moment to latch on to what he's saying from their own political ideology, and he wasn't giving that to anybody really. Um, Another example would be the joke where he says, and I'm going to do an impression of somebody, and you're supposed to guess who it is. And he does this impression of, oh, if you do anything in your life at all, and I find out about it, I'm going to fucking ruin you, blah blah blah. And in the audience, you can audibly hear, you know, more than one person in the audience screaming, and it's basically the only thing you could hear people screaming was Trump. He was doing an impression of Trump, and obviously it didn't sound anything like Trump. So it's just once again playing to that predictable, because that's what a lot of these late night talk show type guys like Trevor Noah, Stephen Colbert, Seth Meyers, Jimmy Kimmel, Oliver North, is that his name? I can't remember. The British guy, all these guys, sort of. I don't think that's his name. It doesn't matter. John Oliver, sorry. uh, they just sort of predictably rail against the number one target of the day, which is Trump, and is very easy to make fun of. And Chappelle purposely goes out of his way not to make fun of Trump. And he explains why in the special, and he says because people get too focused on this one guy, whereas to me there was nothing that surprising about him because he's singing poor white people's greatest hits. You know what I mean? Like everything that Trump was saying was stuff that was already existing in America, was already tangible underneath the surface. It just hadn't boiled over into such an explicit and overt display on the presidential stage. And so he doesn't want to give him the attention. And I think that that's sort of noble. And I believe that part of it is also because he sees those jokes as just too easy and too predictable and just not daring or controversial enough. So basically, that's what I liked about the special. It was a constant juxtaposition between the things that we commonly find acceptable to laugh at and the things that might be a little bit uncomfortable for some of us to laugh at. And it was constantly, oscillated from one to the other, from one to the other. And so it kept you guessing. And so the various controversies that came about, like the Michael Jackson thing, the Michael Jackson line that he was, casting doubt on Michael Jackson's victims, was an obvious tongue-in-cheek joke. He was making fun of himself for being a victim blamer. It was similar to a sketch that he did on Chappelle's show. Very similar. And he was the stupid one in that sketch, and he was the irrational one. And the same in that bit that he did on stage in his recent special. So he wasn't actually, condemning or making fun of Michael Jackson's victims any more than he was, casting doubt on whether or not Chris Brown beat up Rihanna. He was, making fun of himself for holding certain irrational loyalty to certain celebrities that he had looked up to. And I think a lot of that nuance just gets lost on people who are looking for a controversy or looking for something to be offended by, or maybe they just have a sore spot in that one particular issue. Another prime example being ContraPoint's trans YouTuber talking about, he could have just not done the trans stuff. She said that on a Young Turk segment, and she admitted she hadn't seen the special, but she's seen the trans stuff, or she's seen like an excerpt or whatever, and she felt that the joke was poorly done and it's not Dave Chappelle is his best and yada yada yada, which is, it's like everybody's entitled to their opinion, but then she says, and he could have just not done the trans stuff. Well, you haven't seen the special, so you don't know what else is in there. And so anybody can pick out any one particular joke that is a sore spot for them and say, maybe this is over the line, maybe you shouldn't have done this. This happens to be your sore spot, but a comedian can't pay attention to everybody's sore spots at once, because that dampens their ability to create comedy and to explore different topics and to explore different perspectives. They have to sort of be given a pass to step out of bounds a little bit. Now, it's not to say that there's nothing you can do on stage that's going to be seen as egregiously offensive and just over the top, just reprehensible, like, let's say, the Michael Richards outburst. But I think that as long as it stays within the realm of they're really just trying to do a joke, and they're not trying to be mean spirited about it, and they're not really trying to persecute or hurt any, or really, maliciously go after any particular group of people, then I think that it's in bounds, and that they should be given a little bit of leeway. And if you don't find it funny, you don't find it funny. But maybe that's your particular pet issue, or maybe that's your sore spot, or maybe you just didn't like the joke. Also, I thought that they misinterpreted what the joke was supposed to be. Like she was saying, like, that joke is lazy. Like Ricky Gervais did that same joke, like as if the whole joke is just, oh, isn't it crazy to think you're born in the wrong body? But that wasn't actually the punchline of the joke. That was the premise of the joke. The punchline was the Chinese face that he did, which other people might find offensive for different reasons, and you might not find it funny, but I thought it was funny. Other people thought it was funny. It was obviously offensive. It was obviously a caricature, but it was a crude act of physical humor, and it was funny. And so that was the actual punchline. And ironically enough, he mentions in the special his wife hates the trans joke, and he says, why? Because she's Asian. So it once again speaks to the fact that anybody coming from any particular point of view can latch on to one aspect of the joke and find it offensive or distasteful, or it hits their sore spot. But we can't all expect that a comedian is going to navigate around our particular pet issues or sore spots, because there's just too many of them out there for them to be able to navigate that successfully and still manage to do edgy comedy, which comedy has supposed to have been sort of, it not always. There's some comedians that don't do this, like Brian Regan or Bill Cosby back in the day, but very often a lot of the greats are controversial. They're edgy. They go against the norms of their time. It's part of what makes comedians interesting. It's part of what makes their art form particularly useful and in many ways insightful about what it is, the norms and the narratives that we create within a given society. And this goes all the way back to Lenny Bruce, if not further. So the whole idea of going against the PC culture is some sort of new edgelord type of phenomena is utter horseshit. Carlin did the same thing with his 7 Dirty Words. Lenny Bruce did the same thing even before that. Pryor, Chris Rock, Louis C.K., anybody worth mentioning, really. Not to say that, like I said, Brian Regan, there are some safe comics out there, but most of the ones that delve into the realm of dirty comedy, blue comedy, and social commentary are going to play with some social norms to one extent or another. So that being said, there was another thing I wanted to comment on, which was there's a podcast that I listened to that I would recommend. I think it's a good podcast, called Very Bad Wizards, and they were talking about the Chappelle special. And these are liberal guys, and yet they had a much more forgiving and sort of positive interpretation of the special than many other people, like in Vice and Vox and so on and so forth. Which I was glad. So I wanted to comment on a few things that they said about it, because one thing that they said was essentially that, they were expecting to see some anti-PC, lashing out, yada, 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 and they didn't, and they thought that was good because that wouldn't have been funny. I disagree. I think it was sort of an anti-PC thing, but it was a well-done anti-PC thing, and it was, like I said, done in the proper context of a comedian on stage. There's a difference between a well-crafted comedic set that it purposely addresses inflammatory issues, and deals with controversies such as the LGBT controversy, which I thought he dealt with pretty light-handedly, and he sort of had to speak on it to one extent or another because of all the controversy. Not that it was a hell of a lot, but it was more than he probably was expecting from the last special, the trans jokes that he did in the last special, which was his first special in a long time, so he probably was a little bit out of touch with exactly how much the society has shifted on that one particular issue. in those 10 years, because that's the kind of joke that he could have done 10 years ago, would have perfectly fit into his set, into his material, into his persona and everything, and probably wouldn't have made a blip on the screen in terms of controversy or anything like that. But then they said the other thing that was interesting about the special was that the last joke about the heroin addicted whites and comparing the opioid crisis to the crack epidemic and all this other stuff, um, and gun control, that this landed better than anything else in the special, that it didn't cause any controversy, and yet it appeared to be punching down. I mean, this is a disenfranchised group you're talking about when you talk about heroin addicted whites. Just because they're white doesn't mean they're not disenfranchised. You're specifically talking about people who probably don't have money, probably don't have any political clout, probably don't have anybody lobbying in favor of them. They probably don't have any special interest groups looking out for them, like, let's say, GLAAD or the ADL or CARE or so on and so forth, that look for things in the media, or Donahue and his Catholic League, who look for things in the media that go against Catholics, and then they come out with a statement and they say, this is bullshit, you shouldn't. The heroin addicted whites probably don't have any group like that lobbying in their favor, and that's probably why it doesn't cause so much controversy. And they said they were talking about maybe it doesn't cause as much controversy because there was an element of empathy there, because he was comparing these people to sort of the people in the crack epidemic who were black back in the day. And he's sort of saying that he could sort of see himself to one extent or another in these people, and that he could also sort of relate to how white people sort of addressed the crack epidemic back in the day, because just like them, he sort of doesn't care about the opioid crisis. But I don't think that's what it is that made the joke non-controversial. I do think that's what it is that made the joke sort of brilliant, because he was flipping the racial dynamic on its head in a number of ways. First of all, he's comparing the opioid crisis to the crack epidemic and the different ways that society has approached these two different not controversies, but these two different problems. And he says something along the lines of, just say no, what's wrong with that, and so that's funny. And then also he's juxtaposing the common, because he talks about gun control, and he's talking about that, he doesn't say it, but typically when you think of somebody protecting their house with a gun, you think of a paranoid suburban white guy who's probably worried about gang members or crackheads, and probably typically pictures some sort of ethnic minority breaking into their house and trying to steal their shit. And in this case, it's Dave Chappelle, an eccentric rich black man who's worried about heroin addicted whites. So it's an interesting and I think well done joke for a number of reasons, because of the racial dynamics and the way that he flips them in a number of ways simultaneously without really explicitly pointing that out. It's just sort of inherent in the joke. I thought it was very well done. Ultimately, it didn't cause any controversy because the politics are correct. First of all, he's making racial commentary that goes in line with the orthodox progressive agenda, and he is also, not attacking a group that has any particular clout in terms of, the pop culture and people looking to protect them. And that's just a simple fact that, liberals also often talk about it as if it's just simply down to power dynamics when it comes down to punching down or who's okay to attack. It's clearly not. It's not just about power dynamics. It's about historical power dynamics. It's about sort of who has a historical legacy of persecution. And so you don't want to be seen as a bigot in any particular way because we have this legacy of people going after these one particular group, like racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, whatever the particular form of bigotry is. It's all about attacking what is seen in society as a historically persecuted group. Another perfect example being anti-Semitism. So Jews are obviously not particularly bad off in this country, at least. Like not to say that there's no anti-Semitism, but in terms of the power dynamics, they probably are overrepresented in terms of their affluence, in terms of their political clout, in terms of their, the way that they've succeeded in academia, in Hollywood, and all the. And I know that a lot of this sounds like almost like conspiracy talk, or like, almost sounds like borderline anti-Semitism, because some of these are the stereotypes about them. But it's also just blatantly true that they've done well in all these domains, that they're doing well on average in this country. And yet, if you say anything that even veers towards sounding like anti-Semitism, you can be destroyed for that. And the reason why is because there's a large history and legacy of anti-Semitism and pogroms and the Holocaust and all these other things that immediately are conjured up in our minds anytime we come across someone who's being anti-Semitic, which I'm not. I'm just pointing out that it's not strictly down to power dynamics in the here and now. It's also down to perception, to not wanting to be perceived as a bigot. It's sort of a way of keeping, keeping your image clean, because you didn't attack a group that's seen as a protected group. But you can punch down in terms of power dynamics as long as you pick the right group, which Dave Chappelle demonstrated. So I see this video is going on 20 minutes now. I've probably rambled on for much longer than I should have, so I'll wrap it up with that. But I thought it was a brilliant special. Probably not his best one, but I think probably the best special that I've seen out of anybody from in 2019. And I'd recommend it to anybody.